Hey everyone, today's episode is a special one because it's a live conversation with Dr. Donald Hoffman, who is lighting the internet on fire right now. It was recorded at one of our in-person events here in LA. We host these events every few weeks, bringing together an awesome community who wants to explore big questions around philosophy, science, consciousness, reality, and how we experience the world. This conversation is a deep dive into the work he's been doing for the last 40 years. He and his team are likely going to win a Nobel Prize here in the next few years, by the way. And over the last 40 years, especially the last 6 to 7 years, on the scientific approach to what are we perceiving in this world, in this universe, and is it reality? Their math seems to suggest that the chances that we are perceiving reality is 0%. 0% chance that what we are seeing, perceiving, touching, tasting, smelling, feeling, the chances that it is reality, that is what's really happening, their math seems to suggest, as I said, it is a 0% chance that it is what's really going on. As wild as that sounds, there are so many other aspects within their work in the last few years. It's the reason that he is lighting, like I said, lighting the internet on fire right now with perhaps the coolest podcast guest across a lot of the top 10 podcasts that people consume, because this work is up there with Copernicus. It basically is saying Socrates may have been right with the allegory of the cave, of people convinced that the shadows on the wall are real, are reality, and well, the allegory of the cave lays it out quite bluntly. Maybe something else is happening, even though we're so certain what we are seeing is reality. So without further delay, let's jump into this awesome live conversation with Dr. Donald Hoffman on the Daily Vedantic, the fun live conversations we get to record every few weeks here in LA. If you want to join one, shoot us a DM on our Instagram and we can add you to the email list. This was a packed house. Each one seems to be more and more packed with standing room only. So we might have to get a bigger venue, but if you get on the list, then you get the first chance to join in on these live events. So with all of that out of the way, let's jump into this conversation with Dr. Donald Hoffman. Welcome, everyone. So fun to see this many faces on a Friday night for a topic that is near and dear to me, but it's my wife is here. She knows that I will bore people like crazy at dinner when I start diving into this topic. So it's really fun to see a community of like-minded people that also want to dive into this topic, especially when we get to do it with Don. Come on up, Don. Feel free to grab a seat. That's for you. And then we are delighted to get to have this conversation with you, Don. And I'll give a little bit of an intro and background on Don. And then we're going to chat for about 45 minutes, just us, and then open it up for Q&A with you all. And that's one of the most special aspects of a live event like this, is it's not just something to listen to and listen to someone else interview Don. It also, if you have any burning questions on this work, whether it's coming to this talk or on anything that we touch on in the next 45 minutes, feel free to raise your hand and we've got a microphone for you. Dr. Donald Hoffman is at the forefront of consciousness studies in a way that no scientist has really attacked before, and that is through mathematics, through rigorous scientific study around reality. I could talk about consciousness, but really it's deeper than just consciousness. It's him and his colleagues, which we have a few of them here as well. So if any physics questions come up, you guys might get the microphone and have to answer as well. But this topic, I will go so far as to say, I have a feeling Don and his colleagues are going to win a Nobel Prize in the next few years. Sometimes it takes 20. But I think one of the things that we have a chance to do tonight is hear from someone that is not only lighting up the internet with his podcast conversations around this topic, but also can explain it so beautifully, simply for a little simple Texas brain like myself, and make this topic not only he can go to the way deep into the pool in the science, but also in the shallow end to explain why this work is so fascinating. not just important, but fascinating for us tonight. And at least I'll speak for myself. For me, we have chatted and known each other for a few years. And every 6 months or so, you seem to come up with some new piece of information that relights up the internet. And especially in the last year or so, you've been crowd favorite on some of my favorite podcasts, and some of the top podcasts around the world. So some of the most popular podcasts around this topic. And as a cognitive scientist, I'd love to kick it off by asking you, how do you describe, in your own words, the work that you do?
So most of my colleagues who are studying consciousness academically start with space-time and particles in space-time as fundamental. So they're physicalists. And their goal is to try to understand how physical systems that are not conscious to begin with could somehow get the right kind of complexity to have consciousness emerge. And I would say that 99% of my good friends and colleagues who are studying this work are studying the problem of consciousness are physicalists. And so that's the dominant paradigm. So the question is it some kind of integrated information or orchestrated collapse of quantum microtubules? There are all sorts of different kinds of physical mechanisms that could possibly be the magic that turns unconscious matter into conscious experience. And that's what I would say 99% of my colleagues are trying to do. So that's where the game is being played right now. And the question is, so what aspect of brain activity, for example, or what functional properties of the brain or physical systems more generally, or what functional properties of an artificial intelligence would be the magic that turns unconscious circuits and software into the consciousness that experiences the taste of mint, the smell of garlic, and so forth. So that's where most of the work is being done. And the work that we're doing is the opposite direction. We're saying two things. First, they haven't succeeded. Right? If you ask these approaches to give you a specific conscious experience that they can explain, like orchestrated collapse of quantum states of microtubules of Penrose and Hameroff, or integrated information theory, the right kinds of causal structures, if you ask the proponents of these theories, okay, great, you have a theory of consciousness that's mathematically precise. So what specific conscious experience does your theory explain? Like the taste of mint or the smell of garlic, or what can you give us? And the answer is zero. Today, and this is an astonishing thing, and these are brilliant scientists. There are many of them my friends, my colleagues. They're absolutely brilliant. So it's not that like they're dumb. They're really working hard and they're really brilliant. There's not a single specific conscious experience that any physicalist theory can explain. None. So that's quite stunning, because usually science makes some kind of progress. Now, we have made some progress, of course, in measuring neural correlates of consciousness in the brain, so lots of progress there. We can find areas of the brain whose activity is correlated with conscious experiences. That's good work, and I'm glad that we're doing it. But going from the actual mathematical model of the neural network, for example, and saying this kind of mathematical activity in the neural network must be the taste of mint, or it must be the taste of chocolate for principled reasons, there's literally nothing on the table. Nothing on the table at all. So,
and yet that obviously flies in the face of 10 out of 10 people walking down the street. They're like, well, obviously. And even the term physicalist, for those unfamiliar, which is most of us take it so for granted that physical matter is real, space and time is fundamental, that it doesn't even come up in conversation. Therefore, you don't really need a term like physicalist because, well, everybody is a physicalist.
Right.
And it was fun and new for me to hear you use that term, and probably by the fifth time you'd use that term, I realized, oh, that's someone that believes that matter's real, and I'm only 30, 40 minutes into this conversation. And with, I think it was maybe Andre or Tom, there's some of the great podcasters that Don has been on their podcast before here tonight. And it probably took me about 4 or 5 times of you saying physicalist to be like, oh, that's everybody. Everybody basically believes matter is real, obviously, because we're touching it.
Right.
And you and your colleagues are saying, well, we need a name for that viewpoint, because just because 99.99999% of humans have it,
right.
It might not be correct. And it's the way you're just talking right now,
when you've spoken about this before, the thing that comes to mind is like seeing light come from the moon. You and all of your friends see light coming from the moon. And you're like, well, it's obviously coming from the moon. And we're going to study it. We're going to find it. But never finding that source of light from the moon. Even if 100 years ago, 200 years ago, everybody and your neighbor is well, yeah, of course, we got the sun. Yeah, but the moon too. And then science comes along and says, actually, shit, there isn't any light in the moon. Even though it's quote unquote lighting the night sky up, there is no light inherent in the moon. It's coming from somewhere else. And physicalists would be in this metaphor saying, well, it's not even worth studying. Obviously, light is coming from the moon. And you and your colleagues are saying, actually, is this real? And
Right.
space-time, which we think is fundamental, and matter comes from it. If I'm recasting it correctly, you're saying, actually, there's something below that, and space-time is a function of that.
That's right. So the standard assumption is that space and time are fundamental, and particles in space and time are fundamental. And what we're proposing is that consciousness itself is fundamental. So by that I mean conscious experiences like the taste of garlic, the smell of mint, the sense of pressure on your hands and so forth. These are all conscious experiences, and that is the fundamental nature of reality, at least more fundamental than space and time. And so now, I just complained about the physicalists not giving us conscious experiences, right? They can't start with physical stuff and give us conscious experiences. So turnabout is fair play. If I'm going to start with conscious experiences, then what do I give you, right? So what we have to give you is physics. We have to show how we start with consciousness, and we can build space and time and physical objects as a headset. So the idea would be that consciousness is fundamental, but it can look at itself through different kinds of VR headsets. And space-time is just a particular kind of VR headset that we're using to look at other consciousnesses. So it's all consciousness, and the illusion that there's physical stuff is just an illusion because our headset is not showing us all of reality. It's dumbing it down. That's what headsets do. They dumb things down. They make it easier. So interfaces dumb things down to make it easier for you. So we have the illusion that we're dealing with unconscious, like this floor doesn't look conscious. It looks inanimate to me. But that doesn't mean I'm interacting with something that's inanimate or unconscious. It just means that my headset gave up. My headset is trying to dumb things down, make it simple so that I can interact and deal with things. And so, of course, at some point, it's not going to reveal the conscious nature of what I'm interacting with. So what we're proposing then is that space-time itself and all the objects that you see inside space-time are nothing but a VR headset that consciousness is using to interact with other consciousnesses, or to interact with itself. In a non-dualist kind of framework, you would say interacting with itself. And so now that kind of idea, the non-dual spiritual kind of idea, has been around for thousands of years. So now the question for them is to say, look, all the science that we have, all the technology that we have has come from the physicalist framework, right? All the mathematical sciences, the microphones, everything that we have, the lights, this has come from physicalist science. And so surely the burden of proof is on someone who says that physics is not fundamental, that consciousness is fundamental. We have to show that we can do something here. And it's, spiritual traditions have been around for thousands of years, and they don't give us technology. So you can see where the physicalists are coming from. They're saying, show us the beef. What can you do with your stuff? We can build all this technology.
Is that an Arby's callback?
Yeah.
I should have guessed that we were going to be using an Arby's tagline today.
And so what we have to do is, so we haven't come forward in terms of the spiritual traditions with some mathematical model of the spiritual ideas that could compete with the rigor and mathematical technology that we get from physics. So the question is, why haven't we been able to do that, and can we switch this thing around? And so what I'm doing with my colleagues, Chetan Prakash, who's a mathematician here, and Shrapan Chattopadhyay, who's a particle physicist at CERN and Fermilab and UC Berkeley, we're turning the thing around. We're saying, we'll start with a mathematical model of consciousness, and we do have a mathematical model of consciousness. So it's absolutely precise. And in the Q&A, if you want to go into the details, we can go into some of the details of the math. But the key thing we're really working on now is how do we build space-time? Can we start with a model that's only consciousness and get all of Einstein's theory of special relativity and general relativity and quantum field theory from a theory of consciousness? No hand wave. So that's what we're up to, and we think we can. And we have good, I would say, a very good start on getting Einstein's special theory of relativity. And we can talk about the ideas we have on that. And we've had a breakthrough in the last year and a half, 2 years on the mathematics. We've discovered a logic of these consciousnesses that we call the trace logic. And this trace logic is the thing that we're seeing as the bridge that can lead us to actually build space-time, like Minkowski space of Einstein, from a theory of consciousness. And what we see as we're starting to do this is that our space-time perception is just one headset of an infinite variety of headsets that we could in principle construct. And it's actually one of the simpler ones. So when we have this mathematical model of consciousness and we ask, what are the variety of kinds of physicalist headsets that we could build to sort of simplify what we're seeing? Then ours is one of the simplest ones. So from this point of view, we're not sort of the top of nature. We're sort of, we have one of the dumber headsets that's available. And the mathematics that we're developing shows how we could, in principle, conceive of far more complicated headsets. And so the idea here then is simply this. Our goal is to reverse engineer space-time. Space-time is just a VR headset. It's not the reality. So you can see how big a difference this is. There's the physicalist which says, look, this is space and time and physical objects. That's the fundamental reality. Consciousness is a latecomer. That's what 99% of my colleagues think. What I'm saying is the opposite. You've got that completely wrong. Consciousness itself is fundamental, and space-time is a trivial headset that consciousness is using to interact with itself. And there are much more interesting headsets. And the reason why the physicalists haven't been able to give us a single conscious experience is because experiences do not arise from physical stuff.
From our brains.
No.
It's not
They don't arise
neuronal connections, and then boom, you have a conscious experience. Even though
Right.
that is obviously the models that are talked about, the language that we use today.
Absolutely. So now I am a cognitive neuroscientist, and I've done fMRI studies and EEG studies on the brain and so forth, and I'm all for that. I love to look at the brain and correlations of brain activity with conscious experiences. We should do that. But the interpretation that the brain activity is causing the conscious experiences, again, that's the standard interpretation that my colleagues give. And for me, as a hard-nosed scientist, my attitude is, again, until you can actually give me a specific conscious experience that you can explain, there's nothing on the table. If I came to you and said, you know, I've got a new theory of particle physics, and you say, oh, really? Okay, you've got a new theory of particle physics. Oh, so well, what can you explain? Like gluon interactions or photon-electron interactions? I go, oh, no, I can't explain any specific conscious experience. I just can, a specific particle interaction. I can just explain in general. You would probably say that's not very interesting. Come back when you can actually explain a specific particle interaction. And that's where we are with consciousness. The physicalist frameworks have a lot of math, they have a lot of neuroscience, and not a single specific experience that they can explain.
A lot of consensus.
Well, actually, a lot of finger pointing now. Now, some of them are calling each other pseudoscientists and so forth recently.
Calling each other.
Yes, yeah.
Not you.
No,
So, well,
that mine goes without saying.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I was going to say it's you have taken heat for decades and even working in this field, and
Right.
and I want to talk about your background, your arc in 3 parts. One, going back 30, 40 years ago when you decided to study in this area
Yes.
code, and how you even had the antenna to know there was, or to feel like there was something in this area, and then go through decades of not to oversimplify, to be laughed, kind of laughed at, of like, there's what is Don working on?
Right.
And then about 7, 8 years ago, to start to make significant headway in the mathematics of what isn't there, which was its own powerful foundation or a contribution from your work that I want to talk about here in a sec. And now moving in the last, like you touched on the last year or two, but perhaps maybe the last 3 or 4 years, on what is there, which taking something away, what we're perceiving, and we'll touch on that, and then also now proposing what is there, which is just a fascinating unfolding of this arc. Before we do that, just to recast what you're saying there, in the same way that, and we've chatted about this in terms of the dream example, which is the ancient Vedantic example that's given before VR headsets were a thing, where you could, again, 10 out of 10 people on the street, you tell them consciousness seems to have come first, at least with your work proposing, seems to have come first, and then material comes from that. And if they're following, they would say, no. The universe, like we kind of know this, is 14 billion years old. And in the last 2 billion years, life has come about, and single-celled to multi-celled to complex organisms, and then at some point in time, it just switches on and consciousness exists. That's kind of consciousness comes from physical matter. And again, like we were saying, that's 99.99% of the viewpoint. And what you and your team are proposing, it's more perhaps like the dream or the VR headset, where in the dream, where you'd say, if someone said that, none of this is real, the walls, the ground, these chairs, and there's something much more fundamental that you're participating in beneath this, creating all of this matter, you'd say that's kind of ridiculous because it feels so real. And then the dream example is a perfect one. Every single night, everyone in this room, world creators, manifesting an entire world with rooms and walls and people and shoes and gravity. But you wake up and you don't need someone to convince you of it. It's almost so obvious that no one would even take the time to convince you that consciousness of your dream was fundamental. And all of that matter, every shimmer on every wave, every leaf and every tree in your dream was you, was your consciousness creating it. Right. Am I recasting this?
Yes, so yeah, your dreams are a good example how you can create entire worlds out of nothing, just in your sleep. So it shows you, in principle, that you could do this. And what we're saying is that, in fact, everything that you perceive, you're actually creating it on the fly. So to be very, very clear, for example, I'm a neuroscientist, and I very much like neuroscience, but I will say we should study neuroscience, but I would say that neurons exist when you perceive them, and they don't exist when they're not perceived. You render them. If you think about it, again, VR metaphor, when you're using a VR headset, I'm looking over here, and now I'm rendering a Ferrari that I'm racing against. So I render it, but as soon as I move over here, I'm not seeing the Ferrari, and it's not being rendered. That Ferrari doesn't exist. And there's nothing where I'm interacting in this metaphor with a supercomputer, but there's no red Ferrari in the supercomputer. So I'm creating that red Ferrari. And so what I'm saying is that everything that you see, you're rendering it on the fly. That's how good you are. And then you're deleting it. So you're rendering, deleting freely all the time.
Now we're getting into the crazy shit.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which I'm glad we're able to get into that within the first 20, 30 minutes. So, and again, this is so friggin' wild.
Right.
For anybody that took a flyer and was like, I'm going to come to that event on Friday night and is hearing all of this for the first time. Some of these points I might reiterate because you heard it correctly, but you might have been like, I don't know if I heard that correctly. Right. That what you just said was, if you close your eyes right now, everything in this room no longer exists for you or doesn't exist at all.
Consciousness always exists, but your rendering of consciousness into this room doesn't exist until you render it. So consciousness is always there, but you're turning consciousness into this little step, this seat or this, the floor is something that happens by your action of watching. So when you look, you render consciousness that way as a headset. So, but as soon as you look away, then consciousness is always what it is, whatever it is, but you're not rendering that particular thing. So the question that Einstein asked, is the moon there when you don't look? And the answer I would give is no. The moon is there when you render it, and it's not there when you don't look. And the question then, it's one thing to say this, it's been said for thousands of years in spiritual traditions. It's another thing to now say, we want to do science that shows this exactly, so that we actually show that we can start with a mathematical model of consciousness and show exactly how, no hand wave, we can get Minkowski space, Einstein's curved space-times. Excuse me.
We hit time?
Yeah. It went off by itself, good. So how we can get curved space-time, get quantum theory. Our goal, the story of the Big Bang. In other words, one reason why scientists have not taken spiritual traditions seriously is because there's no points on the board. Where's your theory of the Big Bang? We have all this data. How do you explain the Big Bang? Can't do it? Come back when you have something to say. All this theory about quantum mechanics. Can't explain it? Come back when you have a mathematical theory. In other words...
And yet, interestingly enough, many of the quantum theorists and physicists, like Schrodinger.
Right.
Schrodinger's dog is named Atman. So many of them,
Right.
many of them loved the non-dual philosophies. Yet, similar to you, it was like something in a text isn't quite enough, isn't as satisfying for them as pursuing it with mathematics.
That's right. That's the hard-nosed attitude of scientists, right? We want a mathematically precise theory that you can go test and show whether it works or not. And so far, there's just nothing on the board. So spiritual traditions, I think, have the right ideas, but they haven't turned them into mathematics that would be deeper, give us a deeper understanding than space-time physics and quantum mechanics. And that's the goal. I think that space-time is not fundamental. It's a fairly trivial headset that we construct, and quantum mechanics as well. And by the way, I should say that one thing that makes me a little bit bolder on this is that high-energy theoretical physicists are now saying the same thing. They're saying that space-time is doomed, that it cannot be fundamental. So I'm talking about Nima Arkhani Hamed, David Gross.
What is their viewpoint? How do they articulate a similar viewpoint?
Well, their argument from a physicalist point of view is to say that when you bring quantum mechanics and general relativity together, it turns out that when you try to look at things that are smaller and smaller and smaller in space-time, you need to use smaller and smaller wavelengths of light or radiation. And that's fine. You can always resolve smaller and smaller, but then quantum mechanics tells us that by doing that, you're using more and more energy. So you're putting more and more energy into a smaller and smaller region of space. And then Einstein tells us that, well, when you do that, mass and energy are the same thing, so you're actually putting more mass, and you're curving space, and at some point you curve space so much that you create a black hole. And so space-time makes no sense, has no operational meaning at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds, the so-called Planck scale. So space-time is a wonderful user interface, I would claim, and the user interface pixelates away into nothing at the Planck scale. And so the European Research Council, just in the last 2 years, has a multi-million, I think 10 million or 100 million, I forgot, lots of millions of euros on what they call positive geometries. And there are 100 plus physicists and mathematicians now that are saying, okay, we're no longer going to assume space-time and quantum mechanics are fundamental. We're looking for these new structures they call positive geometries, amplituhedron, associahedron, cosmological polytopes, outside of space-time. Now, they're still physicalists, but they're not saying consciousness is fundamental, but they're saying that quantum mechanics and special relativity, general relativity cannot be fundamental. There's got to be some deeper structure that doesn't care about quantum theory and space-time. And they're finding these structures, so they're actually finding them. And so our goal is to show...
Do you mind saying that last part again? The amplituhedron would be an example of a structure that exists outside of space-time.
Yes, right. So the amplituhedron, the associahedra, the cosmological polytopes that they're finding are these geometric structures. Think of them like diamonds, but really high-dimensional, complicated diamonds outside of space-time. And their volumes and their facet structure actually encode in remarkable ways scattering probabilities. If in the Large Hadron Collider, you send a bunch of protons smashing into each other at high rates, and all these particles go spraying out, and you want to predict what you're going to see, these geometries, positive geometries outside of space-time, actually that you compute that remarkably, and much, much more quickly than if you do it inside space-time. So by letting go of space-time, you're getting something deeper that you're missing by sticking with space-time. They're finding some deeper symmetries of nature outside of space-time. And I know when I've talked about this, some people will say, I have no idea what you could possibly mean outside of space-time. Space-time is everything. What do you mean about something outside of space-time? And so what I'm saying is, this is just a headset. What most of us think is all of reality is simply a headset. And when you die, you take it off. And you realize that there's all sorts of other headsets that you could have used. And this is actually not one of the highest, it's one of the more trivial headsets. So what we're up to is saying, if this is a headset, we should be able to write down mathematics and that shows how the headset is built from consciousness. So we have to have a mathematical model of consciousness, show exactly how we get Einstein's theory of general and special relativity, how we get quantum theory, exactly. And in so doing, what we're doing is getting the first layer of software outside the headset. That's what we're really up to. We want to find the first layer of software outside of this space-time headset. Now, my motive is just simply, as a scientist, I want to understand this. I want to, just for its own sake. But the technology that can come out of this is quite obvious. If you're a wizard in some VR game, and you can, Grand Theft Auto or something like that, and you can drive the car faster than anybody and do all the tricks, that's great. But if you know the software, and if you wrote the software for Grand Theft Auto, then you can do magic in the game that the wizard could not understand. And that's what we're really quite interested in.
Like a spaceship that can travel to Andromeda instantaneously because you work from a completely different framework.
That's right.
Than, all right, bigger rocket, need a lot of fuel, and 100 billion light years, and then you'll get there. If
That's
you
right.
can get outside the system and see, as you said in other conversations, in papers, get into the source code of this experience, then everything is at your fingertips. And one additional point, and correct me where I might be wrong on this, you were talking about the dimensionality of the amplituhedron. So in the experience of our universe and this plane we're on right now, we got 4 dimensions, time being that 4th dimension. And something that you and I have chatted about is the amplituhedron. We don't know exactly how many dimensions it has, but would anyone like to take a guess at how many dimensions this structure outside of space-time that has mathematically been found, it hasn't been touched or perceived, but the math points to it. Take a guess if this is 4 dimensions. Feel free to offer a number. Not a colleague. Yeah, go for it. Could be infinite. Yeah, that is great. And 12, great. And I think it's, we don't know the exact number, but it's trillions. Am I right?
Well, infinity is right. I mean, as far as we know, the mathematics that we're evolving, of course, we can't build that in our own little computers that we're working on. We have finite memory. But the mathematics says there's no limit. So the number of conscious experiences is unlimited.
So, and to underscore that again, so 4 dimensions here, and a structure that it's only been in the last 15 years or so that they've discovered the amplituhedron. Is that right?
Yeah, in 2013.
So something outside of space-time that has infinite number of dimensions. I would have guessed 12, 15, and that would have blown my mind. And then I remember seeing this years ago. I was like, we don't know how many, but it seems to suggest north of 13 trillion or something. So basically now maybe it's just infinite.
That's right, infinity. And so what this then allows us to do, as you were saying, is we can do magic effectively. If we know how the headset is built, I'm sorry.
Dude, space-time keeps ringing just to let you know, hey, don't forget about me. Nice try. Nice try, timer.
So if you actually know the source code for the headset, you could take the wizard's car and give it a flat tire. You could take the wizard's car and move it from one part of the game immediately to somewhere else, and it would just be magical. Or you could move it at Mach 40. Or you could make time slow down. Or you could make
cancer.
anything you want because you know the code. And so that's the idea. So there is a little danger here. If we're right, if consciousness is fundamental and space-time is just a headset, and we go about reverse engineering it, then that does lead to technologies that are completely mind-blowing. But it's going to be hard work, so I'm not too worried about it happening anytime soon. But the idea will be that what Chetan and Schwapon and I and our colleagues are doing right now is we have these precise mathematical proposals about how to build space-time and quantum theory from consciousness. And once we have those theorems proven, that's our first goal, is to prove these theorems and publish them. That then says this is a scientifically feasible project. That doesn't yet mean that we have the software. It means that we've proven that it's very likely that this is a profitable approach and we should go after the software. To get the software, then we have to reverse engineer our headset. So how do we know how our headset is being built? Right, that's the question. How do you understand and reverse engineer this headset? Now, this is where neuroscience will be really critical. Most of my colleagues are studying the brain because they think somehow brain activity creates conscious experiences. So we need to understand the neural correlates of conscious experiences. That's all good stuff, but the brain does not create conscious experiences. It's just the opposite. Here's the different way of thinking of neuroscience, and I'm going to say it slow because it's a mind bender. The brain is the headset representation of how the headset is engineered. That takes a while to wrap your head. The brain is your headset representation of how the headset itself is engineered. What that means is that neuroscience is far more complicated than we thought. There are 86 billion neurons, trillions of synapses. It's very, very complicated. We thought we'd have to understand all of that, and then somehow we would figure out how consciousness emerges. And what I'm saying is, as complicated as that looks, the brain is a trivial projection into our space-time headset of the engineering that goes into making our headset. So that's
as complex as the brain seems to us, which is the most complex object in the known universe that we know of.
That's right.
And you're saying it's trivial compared to the complexity of what's actually generating.
That's right.
This brain.
That's right. It's a projection. So there's really some complicated construction process going on, and that complicated process, all we can see of that process is what we can see through our headset, and that's the brain. And so the brain, as complicated as it looks, is trivial compared to what's going on beyond it that's projecting into the brain. So what neuroscience has to do now is we haven't actually started the real problem of neuroscience. The real problem of neuroscience is to reverse engineer neurons, to reverse engineer the circuitry. So right now my colleagues are trying to think about how does the circuitry or properties of neural activity create consciousness? And right now they have 0 successes in terms of specific conscious experiences, 0. And they know when I get on stage with them in front of scientific audiences, and I'll say, so, Stuart Hameroff, so how many specific conscious experiences can your orchestrated collapse of quantum microstates, quantum tubules microstates? And he'll have to say 0. And with Christoph Koh, I'll get him up there with integrated information theory.
Burn.
Yeah, that's right. So, and I do it on purpose, and then we'll go have a beer afterwards. Be friendly. It's all very friendly, but hey, science is science. Until you have something on the table, you don't have anything on the table. So I always take it to them, but they have the same response back. So Don, you got this theory of consciousness. So how much of space-time can you explain? Oh, nothing. Well, come back when you have something to explain. So that's absolutely the hard-nosed attitude that we should have. So our goal then...
You got some pretty cool papers coming out in 2026 that moves that puck forward. So it's
that's right.
We're
doing
starting
that.
to scratch it.
That's
this
right.
stuff. For time, we'll open it up for Q&A here in a second. But so I didn't get to each topic that I wanted to cover with you, but highly encourage anybody on the drive home after this this weekend to listen to the episodes that you've done with some great podcasters. Like I said, some of them are here. Andre and Know Thyself podcast and Impact Theory with Tom as well.
Yeah.
And by the way, shout out to Tom. He said in an episode one time in his podcast, he said that you own a T-shirt that's The Matrix was a documentary. Is that right? That's so beautiful for what we're talking about. If you're hearing all of the science and words that might sound unfamiliar to you, what is being said is maybe this experience is directionally closer to the Matrix than, all right, there's 8 billion of us walking around, and I'm the culmination of a bunch of biology that has presented this as reality, and I'm a tiny little speck within it. Maybe something much more complex and much more fascinating is happening. But one of the last things I wanted to ask you about, and by the way, you mentioned, you touch on Einstein, and even Einstein establishing that space and time are one continuum. That was 100 years ago, and yet we still walk around and we're like, no, space and time. 10 out of 10 people on the street of Venice would say, well, space and time are different. There's space, and then there's time. So these kinds of scientific discoveries, they get made. You might win a Nobel Prize, and still 100 years later, it doesn't make it into the cultural consciousness yet. Well, maybe I won't use that word. It doesn't make it into the cultural lexicon or how we view the world. But it doesn't make it any less accurate just because it's so friggin' different that it's like the sun being at the center of our solar system. You could discover that. You could get burned at the stake by saying it and tell 100 people in a village 500 years ago, and everybody would be like, no, there's no way. I see the sun moving, and it doesn't change their practical lives until it does, until the science does catch up, until we actually do start building out maps that follow stars in a very different way and navigate the world in a very different way than we did 500, 600 years ago with the previous model. So the question that I want to touch on with you is some of your important foundational work that got you a lot of notoriety, you and your colleagues, a lot of notoriety 6-7 years ago, was on this probability that we are perceiving reality.
Right.
And this is kind of like the beginning of you taking away what we think reality is, and then over the subsequent 6-7 years since then, now presenting every 6 months something new on what reality is. But as you're taking reality away, and it really puts you on the map, TED Talk and like I said, lighting the internet on fire the last few years. Do you mind touching on that seminal work on what we're perceiving and the chances that, or the percentage chance that what we're perceiving is real?
Right. So this is a slightly different topic, but they're related. And most of my colleagues, of course, believe in evolution by natural selection. And I think within our space-time headset, that is the best theory we have about biological evolution. So within our headset, the theory works very, very well. But most of my colleagues would say that evolution has shaped us to see reality as it is. I see the moon, that's because the moon really looks like that. I see an apple, that's because there really is an apple there. And I realized in early 2000 that evolution probably wouldn't do that. That it would probably, and Steven Pinker, by the way, at MIT, now Harvard, was saying similar things. He was saying that evolution is really shaping organisms to stay alive, have the perceptions you need to stay alive. And that's very different from saying that you're being shaped to see the truth. And so I decided to look into that. Steve and I are friends, and he'd gotten me interested in this aspect of evolution. But I realized that it might go even a step deeper, that there may be a very, very low probability that we see anything truly if we take evolution seriously. And so it turns out there's something called evolutionary game theory, the mathematics of evolution, and I started to learn it with some of my grad students, and we came up with some simulations that seemed to show that, yeah, the probability seemed to be very, very low that we would be shaped to see reality as it is by evolution. And then I worked with Chetan. Chetan is a mathematician, and he took it to the next level and proved it. So we had done enough work to say this is really interesting. Maybe there's a theorem here, and Chetan proved. And the idea is this, that evolution shapes organisms to do whatever they need to do, to perceive whatever they need to perceive to stay alive. That's what Darwin tells us. So fitness is about having kids. So perceptions that enhance your fitness, what that means is they enhance the chance that you have kids. And it turns out that you don't need to know the truth. So there's a funny example of the jewel beetle. So this is a classic example. There's this beetle that's dimpled, glossy, and brown. The males fly, the females are flightless. And the males fly around looking for females. And if a male finds a eligible female, he'll alight and mate. But in Australia, where some of these beetles live, there are these beer bottles. And some guys in Australia would throw these beer bottles out into the outback. And they're also dimpled, glossy, and just the right shade of brown to excite the males. And so these males would fly around, and they would swarm these beer bottles and try to mate. And even with full body contact with the bottles, they couldn't figure out that this was not a real female. So this is all sorts of interesting, fun stuff there. But so there are all these males forsaking the females for the bottle, and swarming all over, trying to mate. And they actually had to be careful because the species could have gone extinct. So here we have the jewel beetles had been around for hundreds of thousands of years. The males had successfully mated. Just one little change in the niche. Throw out some beer bottles, and all of a sudden the whole thing falls apart and the species could go extinct. So that's how much insight males have into the females. And right. And but more generally, it's how much insight our perceptual systems have about the nature of reality. And so what I realized was that I realized it conceptually, and then Shaitan proved it mathematically. The probability is precisely zero that evolution would shape any of our sensory systems to see any aspect of objective reality. Precisely zero. So that's
Mind saying
stunning.
that sentence again?
Right. That's a lot. What is the probability that, according to now again, I'm just being a scientist now. I'm saying evolutionary theory of our perceptions. According to that theory, what's the probability that what you perceive is the truth? And the answer is the probability is precisely zero, exactly zero.
Not 7%, not
no, that's right.
3%, but 0%.
0%. Now,
according to math, and it's not you guys in a cabin philosophizing. It's
right. This is just from the structure of evolutionary game theory itself.
You were saying, yeah. Do you want to add?
Right. In the
Limit case?
Right. So when in the limit, as your perceptual systems have more and more resolution, right, the probability goes closer and closer to zero. Just a little bit more technical way to say it. But put it this way: don't bet your life on it. I would bet my life that you don't see reality as it is, basically, on evolutionary theory. Now, again, I'm not doing that to diss evolutionary theory. Within the biological organism framework, space-time framework, there's nothing that competes with evolutionary theory. It works, and I've used it in consulting and so forth. It really, really works. So the theory, I think, is a great theory, but it's tied inside of space-time. So it's assuming space and time are fundamental. But it also predicts the demise of space-time as being fundamental. Because if you think about it, we're using evolutionary theory to show that the probability is zero that objects inside space-time, which is what we see, is the nature of reality. Now, several philosophers have published in philosophical journals rebuttals of my work on this, because they'll say, look, you've just refuted yourself. You've shot yourself in the foot. You started off with evolutionary theory, which assumes organisms competing for resources in space and time. And then you show that Darwin's theory says that we don't see reality as it is. Therefore, we have no reason to believe in space and time and organisms competing for resources. So you've shot yourself in the foot. Right? And a lot of, actually, there have been philosophers in major journals who've published this. And they're missing a very, very fundamental thing about science. Science has theories, and every scientific theory starts with assumptions. And the theory says, if you grant me these assumptions, then I will explain all this other wonderful stuff. But you have to grant the assumptions. No theory explains his assumptions. It assumes them. So there is no scientific theory of everything. Now, you can often then get a deeper theory. So I have a theory that makes certain assumptions. I might get a deeper theory that explains those assumptions, but my new theory will have its own assumptions. So no theory is a theory of everything. So science can never give you a theory of everything. In fact, if you think about the logic I just gave you, we will always be infinitely away infinitely away from a theory of everything in science. So there's good reason to be modest about our scientific theories. But what we can do, and what we can do with these scientific theories, is to say, if you grant me these assumptions, then I will give you tools. I can explain certain things. There is a scope to this theory. There is a non-trivial scope. All the technology we have here, from Maxwell's equations and physics theories, they do have a very important scope, and that gives us this technology. But a really excellent theory will not only give you the tools to describe its scope and to explore its scope, it will also tell you its limits. And so, for example, Einstein's theory of gravity together with quantum mechanics, they both assume space-time is fundamental, and they give us the tools to explore space-time, but then they also tell us space-time cannot be fundamental. It stops at the Planck scale, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. The very notion of space-time is no longer even coherent. So here are best theories which assume space-time, and our theories about space-time tell us themselves, without shooting themselves in the foot. No one thinks that Einstein and quantum theory are shooting themselves in the foot logically. They're telling us something very valuable. The very notion of space-time itself falls apart at the Planck scale. And so all I'm doing is the same thing with Darwin's theory of evolution, with evolutionary game theory. Darwin's theory says, I'm assuming that there are organisms in space and time that are competing for resources and trying to mate and reproduce. And that has a great scope. There is no better theory in science to explain all sorts of biological phenomena than Darwin's. It's fabulous. And I've used it successfully with companies to help them with consulting and so forth. It really is practical. But that same theory is so deep with evolutionary game theory. It's so precise that it also tells you that its very foundational concepts cannot be the truth. So the evolutionary game theory, with Chaitan's theorem from it, basically says the foundational concepts of evolution are not fundamental. But we knew that from the beginning, because every scientific theory starts with assumptions, and no assumption can be the fundamental truth.
To underscore that proposal, and this is if there's 3 chapters to the book. The first chapter, so to speak, is outlining, okay, the physicalists, the world thinks the world is this way, the universe is a reality, we should say, is in this structural form, and that space and time are fundamental. The second chapter of the book being what you just said in that foundational work that's so mind-blowing that it's worth underscoring a third time, of the mathematical proof that what we are seeing is 0%, not just like what you're seeing is a low resolution version. Like, oh, you're seeing 3%, there's so much more happening, dark matter, dark energy. And no, it's not that. It's way more extreme. It's not a low resolution version, and it's not, oh, you have a 1% or a 0.1% chance that what we are perceiving right now is reality. The second chapter of the book is taking away everything you're perceiving as reality or fundamental reality completely. That it's not a low resolution version, and it's not a 0.1% chance. At least this mathematical work is saying the chances that you are perceiving reality right now as you're listening to this in your ears and viewing this stage, the chances you're seeing reality, what's really going on, is 0%.
That's right. So I could really summarize what both of these theories are saying about space-time. Quantum theory and general relativity together are telling us that space-time cannot be fundamental. And they tell us precisely where it falls apart, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. It cannot be fundamental. I'm saying evolutionary theory is telling us the same thing, that on its own premises, evolutionary theory is telling us the probability that the space and time that we see is any reflection of reality as it is 0. So our deepest, most successful theories agree. Space-time is a wonderful framework. So it's a wonderful headset. It's the headset that we have, but it's just a headset. And we've gotten to the point, we thought we were describing reality when we discovered physics and so forth. We thought we were describing reality as it is. What science has been doing for the last 400 or 500 years is exploring our headset. And we've just now been discovering that, oh, this is just a headset. We thought it was the reality. It's just a headset. And so now the European, Union has now got this big positive geometry effort, and there's lots of efforts going on in physics to go outside of space-time. And there are hundreds of brilliant researchers now outside of space-time looking for what's the next step, and we're finding these positive geometries. So it's over for space-time. It's not fundamental.
You had a good run.
It had a good run. That's right.
In this third chapter being, well, what is there? And discovering, perhaps perceiving, but certainly all of the attempts to measure what is there after this being taken away as fundamental. And that's the work that you all are doing. And a big, maybe the biggest part of 2026 for you all's work is the Trace Institute, the institute that you're launching. That maybe Gaspar can talk about here for a few seconds as well. But it's, this sounds so, and we're in the bleeding edge of January 2026. This sounds, and it is the bleeding edge of science. It sounds like it is so novel, so crazy, so out there. When it really hits you tomorrow or 6 months from now, what's being said. But this also maps the oldest ideas we have had in humanity, of the oldest philosophical texts, the Vedas and the Upanishads, talking about this concept of this is like an elevated version of a dream. This is not reality. They perhaps didn't have the science, the math, all of the tools that we have today, but there were these certain individuals speaking from experience from the tops of every mountain they could get on, saying, this isn't it. And you have Socrates, perhaps the most famous philosophical concept in the West is the allegory of the cave, which we've all heard 1,000 times. By the time we're 30, we forget how fucking nuts what he is saying and what the most famous philosophical concept in the West is proposing, which maps so beautifully to the philosophy of the East and the Upanishads. A couple thousand years before that, maps so beautifully to what you and your team are proposing. But the allegory of the cave being, these are shadows on the wall. We are convinced this is reality. And every first Friday we have Philosophy Friday in this very room, and where we discuss Advaita Vedanta and really space for any philosophy. And one of the things we were discussing in December was that one of the most interesting things about the Socratic allegory of the cave is, and perhaps it was Plato's idea through the mouthpiece of Socrates, but that everybody's convinced this is reality, the shadows on the wall, this is reality. And the one person that is able to go up and ascend and see, quote unquote, reality is so blinded by it, then reorients, and this is like the sages throughout history that have said, this isn't it, comes back down and tries to tell everyone. And what I'd never, it probably didn't hit me until I was like 35, because you hear that story when you're like 8th grade, 9th grade, and you're numb to it by the time you can really think about it. But one of the most interesting parts of the allegory is that when that person comes down and tries to tell everybody that this isn't reality, they aren't like, what? It's not a glass of water in the desert. They aren't like, show us where it is. They want to kill him. Right. It's so foreign that they actually want to kill the guy. So let's update your security detail, Don, because people will not take this lightly. Okay, with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A from folks, and I think there might be a microphone right behind you. You might be sitting, it might be in the back of your chair that we can, right here, Don, maybe right behind you. Oh. And actually, to kick it off, since I touched on the Trace Institute, Gaspar, who works with Don, do you want to spend a minute or two just talking about 2026 big announcement that if you follow Don's work over the next few years, you'll hear a lot about what they're establishing right now?
Yeah, thank you, James, and thank you for having us, because you're really the organizer and the host for all of this. So thanks so much. I guess, a group of early supporters of Don and people really passionate by this research, Don, Chetan, and Chouapan, are building an institute to support the research, advance the research, to make sure that the Nobel Prize happens next year and not in 20 years, as you pointed out, James. We just want to make sure. So, we want to take sort of like
if it happens after you guys die, I'll find you in that other realm and deliver it to you if I'm still here.
Right. So yeah, I mean the idea is to get as much resources and talent to support the research, and so we're working very closely with Don, Chetan, and Chopin to organize this with the urgency, almost like an entrepreneurial way, a way to accelerate and support the research as much as possible. We called it the Trace Institute. It's a reference to the trace logic, but also the idea that the reality that we perceive is only the trace of a much bigger, like maybe a two-dimensional mark of what is much greater and much more complex behind, right? So yeah, I'm going to be, of course, around if you have any question, and if you think there's any way you want to support this initiative, well, we'll be super happy to talk.
Well, I will tell you from the Magic Mind perspective, Magic Mind will we're going to give a 5-figure donation to the where we exist for magical minds like you all, and so we would be happy to. As I just came across the institute recently, as you were talking about it, happy to make sure Magic Mind supports you all with a donation for that. So thank you for that, Gaspar. Any other? And by the way, find Gaspar or the colleagues or Don right after this. We also have budgeted time for mingling if people want to come up. But yeah, if you'd like to get in touch, we'll send it out to some info on the Trace Institute. You have ideas, you got your own podcast that you'd like Don to come on to, or you just want to chat with him, please feel free to reach out through the details we'll send after this event. Yeah, any questions? See right there, right behind you, Gaspar.
Hello, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Question about birth. So would you argue that when a baby is born, their headset doesn't come on until we project our own consciousness onto them and our own belief, and so they're essentially higher consciousness that's getting dumbed down into our reality because of our perceptions, and are basically bringing them into this, world that we're in right now?
Right. So that's a great question. So the idea would be that each one of us is an avatar that consciousness is using to look at itself, right? So your body is just an avatar. And so the birth then would be we're seeing the actual formation of a new avatar through which, or new headset through which the one consciousness is coming into this world. And it comes in, it's very interesting, it was very humble in a way, right? We're completely helpless. We're, can't feed ourselves. If our parents didn't do anything, that we'd just die. And so it's very, very interesting that consciousness comes in, and you might ask why. What's it all about? And I think that first thing I'll say it's very, very deep, and I don't know the answer, so I'll just say that. But here's some thoughts. There's as Rumi said, the language of God is silence, all else is poor translation, right? Ultimately, anything you say is going to be woefully inadequate, but we're here to talk, so I'll talk. But I first wanted to just sort of note that I think the reality transcends even science on this infinitely. But given that we're going to talk, then Galileo said the language, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. And so I think the more precise, if we're going to talk, the more precise we can be, the better off we will be, the less dogmatic, and the more we'll be able to refute ourselves. So the idea then would be that I think that consciousness transcends any particular headset. And yet, there's an infinite number of different headsets that it could use to look at itself. It's so infinite that there's an infinite number of perspectives that it can choose to look at itself. And that's what it's doing. Somehow, and now I'm way out of my pay grade, but it seems like consciousness somehow, to know itself, needs to know itself from an infinite number of different perspectives, as an aphid, as a nematode, as a human being, as a cat, as all these different, there are an infinite number of creatures we can see, almost, a large number of creatures we see on Earth, and who knows elsewhere. I think we can't think big enough. There's an infinite number of potential different headsets and different ways that we could. So that's my guess about birth, is that it's just an instance of consciousness choosing to look at itself from a particular perspective for 80, 90 years, and it's learned what it wants to learn about itself from that perspective. It was great, and it drops that avatar and moves on.
One of the things that you also talk about in your work, and if we had 3 hours, then we'd be able to get to all these touch points, but that the proposal from your side is that consciousness appears in a independent form in each of us, but it is really just a reflection of a collective consciousness,
Right.
a single consciousness. And again, this is so
Right.
not only contrary to what we kind of perceive in our daily lives, but also just as wildly in tune with Christ's prayer of the Last Supper. 26 verses, and 5 of those verses are, I pray for his own apostles to recognize their oneness.
Right, right.
And
That's-
it's
that-
quite, it comes up again and again, and yet the math that y'all are doing is starting to scratch at these things.
Yeah, and I'll just say that I haven't gotten into the technical stuff about the trace logic, but I'll just say the trace logic is the logic of that. It's the logic of the unity and diversity all at one. It's so it's taking the idea of that there is one, and yet there's an infinite number of perspectives, and it's putting that into a mathematical framework. And it's when we only discovered that framework about 18 months ago. We've been working on, Shaitan and I published a book in 1989. We've been working on this for a long time. So we've been at it, but it was only 18 months ago that we made this breakthrough. And it is the breakthrough that sort of gives us the math that gets at what you're talking about. How could there be, in some sense, one, and yet all these infinite number of variations of it? And it's when we looked at that mathematics that we realized that we were immediately seeing, as we went to different traces at different scales, we were getting different time scales and different distances. And that's when we realized we might be able to get Einstein's special theory of relativity out of this thing. And that's our first goal, is actually show that when you just take the idea you were talking about, that we're all one, and yet there's all these different traces of the one, that actually gives you Einstein's relativity, that different observers can have different times and different lengths as a result of different, what we see as different velocities. That falls, I claim, straight out of the trace logic. And that's going to be one of the first theorems we want to prove, is to show we get Einstein's theory from this oneness, a mathematical model of the oneness, and showing that we're all projections, traces of this one.
Get a hit of ayahuasca and you can kind of, no, just kidding. Might corroborate, you might make a larger donation than Magic Mind. Right, yeah, right over here on this side of the room. Yeah, right there.
First of all, whoa. Amazing. And James, unbelievable facilitating here.
Thank you, James.
Easy to be fascinated by this stuff.
So much. I've been the beneficiary of some psychedelic experiences, therapeutic experiences, and I myself am learning to facilitate. You describe headset as one way to view our existence now. And in these psychedelic experiences, I have seen and had my own experiences where I have felt like I put on my own headset. Have you used, and are you able to come up with the mathematics behind psychedelic experience?
I'm writing a paper with James Gallimore on this very topic. I'm sorry, Andrew Gallimore. Yeah, Andrew Gallimore. Andrew Gallimore and I are writing a paper on this right now. He just gave me a draft. So we're exploring how we might be able to actually, at top level, model DMT kinds of experiences using this kind of thing.
Do you mind spelling out for people that might be unfamiliar why there seems to be even that tee-up that was kind of quite cosmic, because I was joking,
Right.
and then this question comes,
Right.
why there is even those universes colliding around psychedelic experiences in this work?
Right. So what Andrew and the people that he's been working with have discovered is that they go into new realms that seem even more real than this. They're higher resolution, sharper, and more dimensions. And they've had mathematicians who are trained mathematicians go into these DMT trips, and they will be able to describe seeing geometries you cannot see in 3D space. So one hypothesis is so DMT, and by the way, this is all initial work, so this is, a lot of work to do, but these are the ideas. DMT is endogenous. Your body has it right now. So what you're doing is just increasing an endogenous chemical that's already there, sort of like serotonin. In the work that we're doing right now, we've already have a first draft of a proof for how to build Minkowski space. It's not ready to be published, we're still working on it, but already we have a draft of a proof for how to build Minkowski space from the trace logic. And one of the parameters in there is the D, which is the dimension of the space-time. So for our space-time, D is 3. But you can easily imagine just moving D up 4, 5, and the same mathematics goes through. So when we publish this theorem, it will be not of just our space-time, it will be of an infinite set of space-times, and ours is just at the bottom of the rung. We're number 3. But there's 10, there's 5 billion, there's 50 billion. So we're going to be very interested to, so Andrew had been looking for a mathematical framework for years to explain the DMT stuff, and so we connected, and he realized this is the framework that he's been looking for. So that's why we're now collaborating with some neuroscientists as well to try to put this through. So the idea will be that we can now start to explore other headsets and get constraints on how headsets are constructed. So if D is a parameter, does DMT itself switch D up and down? 3 dimensions, 5 dimensions, 5. So you can see our goal as hard-nosed scientists is to use this to give us the clues to reverse engineer. I said we have to reverse engineer the brain. Neuroscience is the brain is the headset representation of how the headset's engineered. This is a first step of the reverse engineering. What is DMT doing in the brain? The brain only exists when you perceive it. The brain has no causal powers, but it's the only clue we have to the realm beyond. So we have to look at DMT in the circuits of the brain and then ask, what does that project from outside? What outside structure of consciousness in the trace logic would project to that? So that's the kind of work that we're doing. So the answer, long answer, yes, we're working on that, and there's a lot to do there.
If I could just follow up on that. Oh, sorry. Please.
Very quickly. No. So for those who are not very familiar with Andrew Gallimore, he's one of the most prominent, researchers on psychedelics, and especially in DMT. But that was confidential. To the best of your ability, we're going to try to keep that,
That's why you come listen to Don and not Gaspar, because Don will give you the goods.
Because Andrew is very prominent and very famous. So what happens also, that's part of the work of the Institute, is that there are, areas in which we find incredible sort of like convergence between, psychedelic reports in many ways, psilocybin disorders, are showing incredible convergence with Don's work, and has for years. Like if you go back to Terence McKenna and so on, there are some papers that we find where the descriptions are incredibly similar to Don's Chetan and Chopin's finding. So that's one of the direction of the research of the Institute. That also includes the contemplative or spiritual tradition as well, non-duality, Advaita Vedanta. But the convergence is completely striking, yeah. So to your point, it's definitely one of the areas of development that we're pursuing.
The convergences and then also the applications. This work, the overlap with how AI models can be built is also so fascinating. In its own realm, it's probably half of the fascination with what the Trace Institute has a chance to do, and what this work allows for. And like we were saying before, in an oversimplified version, going outside of the current system and going into a different system, using the math to then, you don't even need to live in that other system, but use the math that works in that kind of source code that then changes the application that we are all a part of in this kind of plane. And it's the AI application of it is fascinating. If we had more time, I'm sure we could spend.
I could give 1 minute.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So if you think about one important aspect of intelligence is this. If every time I try to do something, I'm surprised. I try to pick up a glass, but it breaks. I try to button my shirt and I rip it. Then I'm not very smart, right? I'm not bright. I'm not very bright. So in some sense, being surprised and or not being surprised and being intelligent are correlated. So the less you're surprised, the more you're intelligent. It's not the only thing that's about intelligence, but it's important. It turns out that the trace logic is provably the zero surprise logic. It is the logic of not only, it's something I talked with Chetan about. I was talking about minimal surprise, and Chetan pointed out it's actually zero surprise. So it's the logic of zero surprise. So it is going to be, I think, a foundation.
Versus space-time being a lot of surprise, maximal surprise?
Well, so it's both. There's two separate concepts here. So the logic itself is about minimal surprise, but then the trace logic, the logic of all these different parts gives us space-time with the time contractions and length contractions and so forth of Einstein. So they're two separate parts of this one formalism. Carl Friston and others are using something called active inference, which they're trying to minimize surprise. They're trying to search to minimize surprise as a way of building artificial intelligences. And so they minimize something called free energy. The trace logic is the logic that they're trying to approximate. That's what they're trying to approximate. So we actually do see this as a next generation of AI as well.
Go back to this side of the room. If someone has I saw some hands before. Yeah, sure, right there. Here we go. We'll give you the mic just for the recording. That we'll have to edit the Andrew stuff out. Don't worry, guess what?
Thank you for sharing. It truly is mind-blowing in a lot of ways. If there's a mathematical model to measure consciousness, then you can measure it? Or where do you go from there? And then the counter, or the kind of deeper question is, can someone control it?
So the mathematical model will allow us to understand how consciousness is creating everything that we see inside of space and time. And if this is a headset that consciousness is created as one way of looking at itself, and we reverse engineer it, then the technology that will come out of that is indistinguishable from magic, literally indistinguishable. Everything that we have will be trivial so far compared to what would happen if, again, the example of the person who's an expert at some VR game, the wizard, but the person who wrote the code and actually knows the code can just do magic that the wizard would never even understand. So that's what this could open up. So we actually have to be careful because it's a Pandora's box.
All right, we got time for maybe one or two more questions right there in the striped shirt. Yeah, you right there. If you could pass the mic back, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for an amazing lecture. And my question would be, a lot of the times when we talk about conscious, we also say, oh, subconsciously I thought that, and subconsciously I did this. So if our consciousness is a headset, what is the subconsciousness?
Fantastic. That brings up another aspect of the trace logic, and that is that there's all these different traces are effectively different conscious agents or consciousnesses. And so what we're showing is what you call your consciousness could have all sorts of subconsciousnesses. And in fact, the whole trace logic is the logic of all the subconsciousnesses. To
trace logic just meaning what we're perceiving is a tiny trace of what's really happening. So that's why we keep using the word trace logic.
That's right. It's that, and it's also a very technical term in the theory of Markov chains. So when you have a big Markov chain, you can take traces and make subchains on it. And it turns out that that's what we're using, that kind of technology from the theory of Markov chains. So it's very precise mathematical. So the notion of trace, actually, there is an equation to write down that describes what a trace is. But informally, what it means in the case that you're talking about is that the trace logic is showing the relationship of all these different projections of consciousness. So it could effectively be, yeah, here's what I'm calling my consciousness, and here's a subconscious thing, or non-conscious. In some sense, your consciousness is only indirectly known to me. I have to talk with you to understand what's going on in your conscious. But inside you, you have two hemispheres, like the left and right hemisphere, that are joined by the corpus callosum, about 200 million fibers. And if you have the corpus callosum cut, you can actually show that the right hemisphere has a different consciousness and different conscious experiences from the left. And the right hemisphere has a different personality, different religious beliefs, and different likes and dislikes than the left. So you have like two separate consciousnesses combined by the corpus callosum, and then much more. And the trace logic is really a mathematical logic that's showing how all these things could possibly connect.
Yeah, it's really wild stuff. Yeah, we'll go right there.
Thank you. And honestly, this is some mind-blowing stuff. So this was an excellent discussion, and thank you for hosting.
Thank you for coming.
I have two questions, and they're related. The first question is if I understand correctly, which I probably don't, is space-time an emergent property of consciousness? Is that an accurate way of saying it? And then the second part of that question is, I'm not quite sure the way that you're using the word consciousness, I'm not quite sure I understand that. How are you defining that?
Okay. Right, so there is a sense in which you could say that space-time is emergent. It's a particular format that consciousness uses to represent itself. So in that sense, you could think of it as emergent. For those who are interested in a technical definition of what we're doing here, we have a paper online called Fusions of Consciousness. So if you Google my name and Fusions of Consciousness, you can actually see a paper online that's a published paper. It doesn't have the trace logic. We're writing the paper right now on the trace logic, but it has the fundamental definition of conscious agents that you can see. So it's out there.
You can download it, upload it to ChatGPT, and go to town if it's too technical. That's what I have to do.
But if you want to see the trace logic mathematics itself, just email me at ddhoff@uci.edu, and I can send you a write-up about the trace logic, the mathematics. But it's Markov chains and traces of Markov chains are the fundamental idea.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, one more. Back right there. Yeah, we can pass the microphone back.
Hi, I hope I'm still on topic, but listening to your theory at first, it kind of seems kind of lonely that once you're not like even looking at you, that somehow I'm moving through this binary system of information and I'm making you up to make sense of reality, right? But when you said our brains could be a projection of a bigger technology of consciousness, it kind of makes me think of how you explained the moon and light earlier, that we're all just like reflections of this. But then we're only humankind. So there are other creatures that we know move through echolocation or that have different color conical spheres in their eyes. Is there a way to try to access their version or flavor of consciousness? Or is this a particularly Homo sapien take?
That's a great question. And the idea is, as you said, that there's all these different ways that consciousness can experience itself as Homo sapiens or as a bat. And there's a famous paper by Thomas Nagel called "What's It Like to Be a Bat?" So there's that kind of question that we can ask. And for us right now as Homo sapiens, it's hard to imagine what it's like to be a bat. But I think that with technologies like DMT and so forth, some people start to be able to expand their horizons about the kinds of experiences they can have. Maybe not into the bat area, but beyond normal human experiences. And I think that as we begin to understand how the human experience is a particular headset and how the bat experience is a different kind of headset, and we begin to get the mathematics of how they're related, we may then be able to develop technologies so that we can actually better have a chance of understanding what it's like to be a bat. So I think it would be quite interesting. So I think there's a lot to do there, but probably won't happen this year.
And you can go up a level and perhaps go up a level and see consciousness from a higher level than
Yes.
our current one, to where maybe it's the least lonely thing in the world to see
Right.
clearly that, just a hypothesis, to see clearly that everything you've ever perceived is multiple versions of you. Okay, Don. Well, thank you so much for the time tonight.
Thank you very much.
Feel free to come up and say hey to Don. We got to get him to a dinner here in about 10 minutes, but feel free to come say hello to him, Gaspard, his colleagues, and stay tuned for all the Lighthouse events that happen here on a monthly basis. Thank you again, Don. Thanks so much.